Hi, class. This is part two of chapter two on culture. In part one, we discussed the concepts of society, culture, the distinction between material and non material culture, and then we went over the two primary elements that make up material culture: artifacts and technology. So, in parts two and three, we are going to be tackling non material culture. So, we begin by discussing the concept of symbols, because another way of thinking about non-material culture is for it to be considered symbolic culture. Symbolic culture is based around the concept of symbols, and symbols are cultural representations of social realities. So this is how we attach meaning to something that doesn't inherently have a meaning or a concrete definition by itself. So when we think about examples of symbols, this would be everything from gestures to language to values, norms, sanctions, folkways, mores, and we are going to be talking about all of those in today's in this chapter. We'll start off by focusing particularly on the symbols that are used as a means of communication, of which that would be gestures and language. So we begin with gestures. So the definition of gestures is these are movements of the body that are used to communicate with others. It's a shorthand way of conveying messages without using words. And that's important, that the purpose of gestures is to convey a specific meaning, because although you can't see me right now, I am the type of person who talks with my hands. My hands move when I talk. But those random kind of flailing movements that I do with my hands don't actually have a meaning. So they are not they would not meet the definition here of being a actual gesture. But there are gestures that do have meanings. They symbolize something. They represent something in our culture. So whether you're talking about the peace sign, or by, stop, or giving someone the middle finger, or waving, or a few years ago when everybody was dabbing everywhere, right? It's the idea that a gesture is meant to convey a specific meaning. And because it is symbolic, and therefore it is socially constructed and fluid across different times and spaces, the gestures that have a specific meaning in the United States might potentially have a very different meaning outside of the United States. And that's what you see in the image here. This is from a web page that was set up to help travelers by explaining that some of the common gestures that we do in America might mean something different depending on where you travel. So take, for example, the stop sign. So holding your hand out, palm facing outward, all your fingers facing up. You might do this sign if you've ever crossed the street and you're concerned if a car sees you, if they are going to stop. You might hold out this stop hand. But it's worth noting that in Greece, if you were to do this gesture, that you would actually be telling someone to go straight to hell. And so that's just one example of how a gesture that has a very specific meaning in one context, in one society, might have a different meaning somewhere else. But even more so than gestures, we have language. Before I get to language, it's just worth noting, this is an example from your book, that some gestures that represent what we call fundamental emotions like sadness or anger or fear, they appear to be inborn, which means they are less likely to vary over time and across space. So for instance, a crying child. Children cry in all cultures, and the meaning behind their crying, their tears, that meaning doesn't really vary depending on whether it's a crying child in China or India or America or Russia. in Brazil, this is an example of a gesture that seems to be fairly consistent across time and space. But most gestures do not fit that type of criteria. Most gestures are, in fact, socially constructed and therefore do vary across time and space. But the more important of the symbolic elements related to communication is language. Language is key. It's how, besides communicating with one another, I mean, it is the basis of most human interaction. It's how we develop relationships. It's how we socialize our children into our traditions. It's how we write, save things, remember things. Language is very key to human society. And so when you see that definition there, that language is just a system of symbolic, verbal, nonverbal, and written representations rooted within a culture, this might be a very interesting way to think about language, because we oftentimes don't consider the very symbolic nature of language. Once again, going back to that taken for granted orientation to life that we discussed in part one. But when you think about it, every word that is just a collection of syllables that we have attached a particular meaning to, there is nothing inherent in those syllables that makes it so that that word means what we say that it means. So if I say hello, you know that that means it's a greeting. I'm greeting you. It's a salutation, right? But there is nothing about those actual sounds that mean that definitely had to be the word for hello, which is why in French, bonjour, which is the same meaning, right? Different set of sounds. The fact that in France, if you were to say bonjour, people would know what you were talking about. And in, countries that speak English, they would know hello, that you are, that is a greeting. That is because we have attached that particular meaning to that collection of sounds. And if you've never thought that deeply about language, I don't blame you. But we know that this is the case because when we consider new words and phrases, so it can be a little odd to think about words that we've been using for centuries and apply this analysis to it. But if you think about it in terms of slang, so you see that chart there that depicts some popular teenage slang, then it makes a lot more sense that we decide Gucci, instead of being just a name brand designer, means that something is good and cool, right? As a culture, we had to come to this shared definition that that is what this word now means. Same with a word like bae. If you were to go get in a time machine and go back even 10 years and said, yeah, I'm going out tonight with my bae, no one would know what you are talking about, because there is nothing about that word that inherently means what we say that it means. It's because we have invented that word, we have socially constructed that meaning, and we've come to an understanding and an acceptance of that definition. And that's true of all language. And so that goes along with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is meant to address the question that, does language in fact shape our reality? Like, once we create a word or a term, how does that then impact how we see the world around us and how we interpret the world around us? Because that is what the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis basically says, that our understanding and our actions emerge from language, that through language our world makes sense. Because once we name something, once we name a phenomena, and that name that becomes part of our common language, and so that other people can recognize when that phenomena is happening with them, we have in truth kind of created the phenomenon. Not that it didn't necessarily exist before we named it, but now that we named it, we can recognize it for what it is. So people were getting their communication ignored long before people used the term ghosting. But now that we have the term ghosting, if you've been ghosted, you can recognize when it's happening to you. You have a way of labeling it. You have a way of describing it to other people without having to go in a bunch of long additional details about exactly what happened here. You just say, I was ghosted. And because that is a term in our modern day language that has a meaning, people will know what you're talking about. So in this way, basically, we create our consciousness by creating new words or by giving new definitions to words that we currently have. And I encourage you, if you want to see some adults getting teenage slang wrong, check out that YouTube video, which basically just involves people a little bit past their teenage years offering their interpretations of some common teenage slang. And you'll see that you're right. When you don't know a term and you're having to just take a random guess, it really just strikes home how much of this is in fact socially constructed and therefore has to be learned. And so now we move to the other components of non-material culture, symbolic culture, and these other components are, instead of being related to communication, they are related more to how we interpret and make sense and give meaning to the world around us. And one way we can describe these other symbolic elements is by using the word ideology. And ideology is the information that we use to interpret experience and help order societal life. And the three primary components of ideology are additional non-material cultural elements. And those components are beliefs, norms, and values. Similar to language, similar to gestures, ideology is also socially constructed. And we're going to talk a little bit more about why that's important as we get to the later videos and we talk about culture shock and cultural relativism. But it's enough right now just to say that although we might believe that our beliefs and norms and values make sense and they're the only way of thinking or believing or doing things, it's just worth noting that we did construct these components, which means a different society or our own society at a different period of time perhaps had very different beliefs or very different values or very different ways of behaving, which is the basic definition of norms. So for the final part of this presentation, I'm going to tackle two of these components. The two that students often get confused and mixed up with one another, which are beliefs and values. So values are just the general standards in society that help us kind of define our standards, our principles. It's a judgment of what is right and wrong, what is important in life. And examples of values include things like loyalty, fairness, courage, compassion, respect. If you were to answer the question, what are some important American values? You might say things like patriotism, equality, and freedom. Usually, if it's a value, it can be encapsulated in one word. It doesn't require a lot of explanation. Your book has some pages on value clusters and value contradictions. You don't really have to go too deeply in that material. It's enough to know that sometimes we have a value, something like success, that is comprised of a bunch of other corresponding values, right? So under the value cluster of success, we might have things like wealth, or we might have things like hard work or work ethic. We might have things like responsibility or status or admiration. And that's just a way of saying that although we value all those things separately, we also value them all together jointly as part of a value cluster, the cluster of what does it mean to be successful in our society? How do we define it in terms of other values that we also admire or look up to? But in our society, we also sometimes have something called value contradictions, which your book also discusses. And this is the case that in in a lot of ways, some of the things that we value contradict with other things that we also value, which makes it difficult sometimes to figure out how to behave or which values should guide our behavior in certain contexts or situations. So, for instance, in America in particular, we value individualism, right? We value you being your own person, you being independent, you making decisions for yourself. But then at the same time, we value you being a good community member, that we value, so we value communality. We value people that are sociable, that work well in groups. And so that means that people have to kind of strike a balance in their behavior, because we are telling them that we value two contradictory things. We value you being your own person, but then we also value you being a good group member as well. The other non-material element or symbolic cultural element here is beliefs. Beliefs are just ideas that people accept as being true. The things that we believe to be true. And it's worth noting, as the chart notes, that a lot of beliefs are related to religion, but beliefs can also be based on superstition. So maybe you really do believe that black cats are unlucky, or walking under a ladder will bring you bad luck. Beliefs can be based on science, they can be based on tradition, they can be based on experience. The examples from the chart include things like lying is bad, God created the world, cheating is immoral. And sometimes we believe things and we consistently believe them, and we hold these beliefs to be true for a very long time, centuries of established belief. But sometimes, we accept the fact that we were wrong about things. So people used to believe that the world is flat. Now, unless you're a flat earther, people don't believe that anymore. We used to believe that certain races, were inherently superior to others. Now, unless you are in fact a racist or a bigot, you don't necessarily believe that anymore. So, like anything that is socially constructed, beliefs are socially constructed, which means that they are fluid. So just because we believe something at one point in history does not mean that that is going to be our belief for the rest of all time. Similarly, just because we believe something to be true in America doesn't mean that someone in another country does not believe that to be true, or believes something else very different from what we believe to be true. So that's it for this second presentation. In the third presentation, I'm going to be tackling the third element of ideology, norms. And that's because there is a lot of additional vocabulary associated with this element, so I wanted to dedicate a separate video to that. All right. Thank you for watching.